En nombre de Time Warner, CNN y Turner, bienvenidos y es un placer tenerlos aquí en nuestra casa para este evento tan importante. On behalf of Time Warner and CNN and Turner, I want to welcome you, and we are delighted to be your host for this important evening, MALDEF Latino State of the Union 2018. MALDEF's important work is to bring Latinos into the mainstream of American political and socioeconomic life, provide better educational opportunities, encourage participation in all aspects of society, and offer a positive vision for the future. I can't tell you how important that work and mission is to our community. You see, my mom and dad didn't finish grade school, despite the fact that they had little formal education and even less money. What they did have is hope. Hope that fueled the vision of a better life and future for their children. So from El Salvador and Colombia they came, teaching me to be proud and never forget my culture, to respect the language, but to also embrace, engage, and thrive in American life. They raised 3 children, pulling off that amazing feat that so many of you may have also experienced, the feat of never making us feel like we were poor, providing food on the table, clothes on our back, and more importantly, putting all of us through college. They learned English and about their new culture, reading and watching news, and instilled in me a voracious appetite for media and intellectual curiosity. All that led to my pursuit of journalism, and thanks to them, a successful career at places like NBC, Telemundo, and now CNN. So it is indeed a privilege and an honor to have an important seat at the table at a major media company like CNN. But as my mom instilled in me, it's also a responsibility. As she taught me so long ago, being different is an asset. Don't be ashamed of where you come from. On the contrary, it's a gift you should and must share with others. That lesson has governed my vision and action as head of diversity and inclusion for CNN. It has led me to evangelize throughout our global company the definition of diversity and inclusion, which is the appreciation of difference and unlocking its value. Here at CNN, we are very proud of our work in diversity, and we strive to lead the way. Jim Acosta and Boris Sanchez are part of the most diverse White House team in all of TV news, working hard at holding this administration accountable. Evan Perez leads our investigative team in Washington, where our focus on facts first is having a big impact. And as you can imagine, he's been very busy these days. Leila Santiago shined a big light on what some thought was a little island called Puerto Rico, at a time when those in power weren't paying attention to a whole island with literally no power. Her coverage surely helped change that. Ana Cabrera is one of the few Latino anchors in primetime television, and CNN en Español has led the way in coverage across the Hispanic U.S., Mexico, Central, and South America. At CNN, we believe to cover the world, you need to look like the world. And that's what we've done. Because never has the world and our country been so challenged. So at CNN, we shine a light in dark places. We give voice to the voiceless, and we ask the important questions. Some are obvious. What kind of country do we want to live in? How should our leaders spend our money? Some are hard. What should happen to the dreamers? And does it make sense that a 3-year-old Latino toddler should come before an immigration judge without an attorney? This hard work of holding the powerful accountable and seeking the truth is our commitment at CNN. And that's why we are excited to host MALDEF, as it helps explore answers to these questions tonight and every day. MALDEF's mission is to protect and promote the civil rights of all Latinos living in the United States. Tonight, I have the privilege of introducing its leader, Thomas Sands. In 2009, Tom returned to MALDEF after serving as counsel to the Los Angeles mayor, Antonio Villaraigosa. He previously practiced civil rights litigation at MALDEF for 12 years, where he challenged California's anti-immigrant Prop 187. He led numerous civil rights cases on immigrant education, employment, and voting rights. And he won victories against unlawful restrictions of day laborers, challenged California's congressional redistricting, and initiated the employment discrimination lawsuit, resulting in a $50 million settlement with Abercrombie & Fitch. He's a Southern Californian, and he's a Yale Law School grad. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome President and General Counsel of the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, Thomas Sands.
Thank you, Ramon. Thank you for welcoming us. Thank you for the work that you do at CNN. Thank you for sharing with us your mother's wisdom. It is indeed unfortunate that we live in a time when that very powerful notion, the importance of valuing difference, is a matter of significant debate with those who would seek to suppress difference, who would seek to diminish the importance of diversity, who would seek to eliminate, in certain cases, entire groups from significant consideration in our country. We come together at very challenging times, but I welcome all of you here in the room, watching on live stream, or watching a tape of this important panel discussion. This is MALDEF's 11th Latino State of the Union event, and we once more have put together a distinguished panel of experts to discuss with us the challenges faced by the Latino community and how we might work together to address successfully the challenges that we face today and those that we may face in the days to come. It's my great pleasure to introduce our panelists. Closest to me on the podium is the eminent Dr. Elena Rios, who is the president of the National Hispanic Medical Association, which she has headed since 1998, an organization that she helped to co-found. Dr. Rios has worked throughout her career to improve the recruitment and success rates of minority students in United States medical schools. She is a co-founder of the National Network of Latin American Medical Students from when she herself was in school. She holds degrees from Stanford University and UCLA, including her medical degree. It's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Elena Rios today. Sitting next to Dr. Rios is Ivan Espinosa Madrigal, a familiar face at MALDEF because he began his legal career after receiving his law degree from NYU School of Law in a MALDEF Fried Frank Fellowship, where he spent 2 years working at the law firm of Fried Frank here in New York, and then joined MALDEF in our San Antonio office. But his trajectory from there was to increasingly important leadership positions. He previously has worked for Lambda Legal, the preeminent organization advocating in the legal arena for the LGBTQ community. He previously was legal director of the Center for HIV Law and Policy, and he is today the executive director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and Economic Justice in Boston, Massachusetts. Please join me in welcoming back our former Maldefian, Ivan Espinosa Madrigal. Next to Ivan is Claudia Flores, who is a recognized nationally spokesperson on issues faced by immigrant youth and is currently the immigration campaign manager at the Center for American Progress. Before she joined CAP, Claudia led the immigration policy portfolio for the National Latina Institute for Reproductive Health, where she worked to develop and advocate for policies to expand healthcare access for low-income immigrants and their families. Claudia has extensive experience in the federal policymaking process, drawing from her time working in the U.S. House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. She holds a Bachelor of Science from Santa Clara University. Claudia is also a familiar face for having spent a number of years in MALDEF's DC office, working for another organization, but always working closely with our MALDEF advocates. Welcome, Claudia Flores. And to my far right, as he often is on policy positions, I'm teasing as someone who needs no introduction. Hector Sanchez is the Executive Director of LACLA, the Labor Council for Latin American Advancement, and the longtime chair of the National Hispanic Leadership Agenda, or NHLA. For those who are not familiar, NHLA is a coalition of 45 of the most prominent national organizations advocating for the civil rights of Latinos in the United States. Throughout his career, Hector has worked in labor, human and civil rights, education, and nonprofit organizations with vast experience in policy advocacy, organizing, research, and community outreach. He is also, or has served, as the co-chair of the Hispanic Council on Federal Employment, working to attempt to address one of our most significant and enduring issues, underrepresentation in the federal workforce. Please join me in welcoming back, since he's been with us before at Latino State of the Union events, Hector Sanchez.
Thank you.
Let's get started. So I want to begin by recognizing that today we convene on the 50th anniversary of the tragic assassination at the very young age of 39 of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968. Now, there are many who have in recent days drawn parallels between 50 years ago, 1968, a scary time for many after seeing the assassination of Dr. King, only to have that followed just 2 months later by the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy. It was a frightening time for those who were advocating, as they had been for many, many years, for civil rights and equal rights for the African American community and other communities. Some folks have suggested that we face a similar period of crisis today, 50 years later. I'd like to ask each of you, obviously you are all too young to have been particularly cognizant of what was going on in 1968, 50 years ago, but clearly from what you know about history, what you know about those days, all of you having devoted your careers to civil rights concerns, what do you think on this 50th anniversary? Are there parallels with what this nation faced in 1968 in the middle of a presidential campaign that ultimately resulted in Richard Nixon being elected with his appeal to the quote-unquote silent majority? And what can we learn from that period and its aftermath 50 years ago? Shall we start with you, Dr. Rios?
Well, definitely, yes. There are parallels, and I just want to say I think the words of Martin Luther King about wanting to be at the mountaintop is apropos for what I think, looking at healthcare issues in our community. We are so stressed in our communities with middle-class America and working poor immigrants. We have so much a harder time to reach that mountaintop of quality life than ever before. And this generation is going to be the first generation where children will die younger than their parents or die earlier than their parents because of obesity, because of opioids, because of stress, because of all the change in our economic jobs and loss of jobs and not being able to buy a home and kids living with their families longer. So I just think that there's a real distinct parallel for our communities that happen to be in the working classes of this country.
Thank you, Dr. Rios. Yvonne?
I completely agree. You know, I think it's difficult to not see a direct parallel between what happened at the height of the civil rights movement and what's happening today, particularly when we have racial violence and bigotry being displayed, for example, on the streets of Charlottesville, and people dying as a result of those incidents. I think the parallels are actually quite striking in terms of efforts to dilute federal protections and civil rights protections that were very much hard-won. I think it's a result of a lot of complacency and also the demographic changes that are happening in the country, which includes not just African Americans, but people who look like us, Latinos, and also Asian Americans, and our place in this country, and whether we're going to be welcomed as people who belong here or we're going to be under attack. And I find that that having this event, Tom, on the anniversary of his assassination 50 years later is really powerful, because I think we as a society haven't moved forward in terms of race and equity.
Claudia.
To me, I think, this day is a reminder that the legacy of Dr. King must be carried on the backs of everyone, all of us who believe that you can fight and you can win a more inclusive, a more humane society. One of the, out of many of his speeches, writings, one of my favorite, and one that always reminds me of which direction I should be looking into when doing my work, is this notion that we're living through a great revolution and that we can't sleep through a great revolution. And that is why when we look at the plight of dreamers, the work that is happening across the country, where there is this level of division, but at the same time there is this level of recognition that it is inclusiveness what is going to move us forward, that it's going to promote progress. And I think there has been a new wave of voices that are going to be carrying Dr. King's legacy. So to me, today is a day of a reminder of that tragic loss that struck a nation, but also a day that bears responsibility for us to, in the middle of I think, a time period where it feels like a lot of the attacks are similar. It is up to us to continue that drumbeat towards justice.
Thank you. Hector.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you to MALDEF for the invitation of all the advocacy that MALDEF represents. Today is the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Dr. King, and we celebrate the legacy of Dr. King. It's also the 50th anniversary of MALDEF. I think MALDEF really represents the legacy and the values of Dr. King and what Dr. King was all about. So I just want to start by thanking MALDEF. I just arrived from Memphis today. I was in Memphis on the 50th celebration of the legacy of Dr. King. It's just quite a powerful moment. I think all of us should take a moment to really reflect on the work of Dr. King, listen to some of his speeches, and really put that in the context of what we're facing as a nation nowadays, what we're facing as a democracy, what is on the line when we're facing all these issues. I'm personally in debt as an immigrant, as a Mexican immigrant, with the African-American community. I had the honor to be trained in organizing by an African-American lady that was part of the civil rights movement, Satura Sims, in one of my first jobs here over there in D.C. And we had the opportunity to travel in different parts of the nation, and to that traveling, we had the time to listen to all the knowledge, to learn a lot of the struggle of African-American brothers and sisters. So I'm so in debt. There is one element, one space that was so important for me, and I think it was reflective of what we're living as a nation. It was the 47th anniversary of the Selma to Montgomery March, a march that we can remember. It was a march that exemplified a moment where people put everything on the line. People die for fighting for our democracy, for having the right to vote, in this case for African-American brothers and sisters. But it was more than that, just to have a better democracy in the nation. We came 47 years after that to the 47th anniversary of the Selma to Montgomery March at a unique moment in history. And this was before Trump. It was the moment of HB 56, at the time the most anti-immigrant piece of legislation in the nation. It was the moment when the unions were under attack. It was one of the moments of the highest attacks against the LGBTQ community. It was a moment when we were facing a lot of challenges against the voting rights in the nation. So it was a unique moment where we all came together and we marched in the Selma to Montgomery March under the values of Dr. King, but at the same time, all of us coming together to say enough is enough. So we have been facing some of these challenges for a very long time, and this is a good moment to really reflect on those values, but at the same time, look at the opportunities that we have ahead. What are the opportunities that all these communities that are facing similar challenges, similar struggles, all the attacks and increase on hate crimes, all the attacks on the LGBTQ community, all the attacks on dreamers, immigrants, all the attacks that against women, all the attacks that I think this administration represents. And this is not only Trump, this is the conclusion, like not the conclusion, the moment in history of something that has been coming for a number of decades. So this is a unique moment to really look at opportunities, how we can come together, reflect on the legacy of Dr. King, and more than anything, something that Dr. King strongly believed in as a solution was to organize, and unite communities across sectors.
Thank you, Hector. And as often happens, Hector has anticipated what I was going to say next, which is on a decidedly more hopeful note in 1968, I hope. Folks see it that way. MALDEF was founded 50 years ago. We opened our doors in August 1968 in San Antonio, Texas. Now, I've often said that when MALDEF was founded 50 years ago, one could fairly describe the Latino community in the United States as concentrated in the southwestern states that had previously been a part of Mexico, with pockets of significant population in Chicago, New York City, and Florida. 50 years later, we are now the second largest racial ethnic group in the country, the largest minority group, and have had that status for over a decade. Perhaps because of that and the anticipated future growth of our community, we have a president who targeted the Latino community in particular in launching his campaign in 2015 by slandering Mexican immigrants. He doubled down on that theme a year later in the middle of 2016 by accusing a federal judge of being biased against him simply because that judge was Mexican American, U.S. citizen born here, but Mexican American in descent. Since taking office, many would argue that Donald Trump has continued by governing how he campaigned, particularly with respect to the Latino community. In 1968, Richard Nixon was elected by the quote-unquote silent majority. He was not as specific in targeting one community. He could be a little more amorphous because he knew that folks were concerned about different movements, women's movement, the civil rights movement, youth, and anti-Vietnam building up. But the president we have today has been much more specific about targeting particular communities, including the Latino community. Reflecting on the work that you do, how has that targeting by this administration or more broadly affected the important work that each of you engages in? Yvonne, let me start with you.
Well, it's almost unbelievable, right? The unprecedented amount of attacks, number of attacks that we've experienced. You know, and at a place like my organization in Boston that was also founded in 1968, so we're celebrating our 50th this year, that has been working on civil rights issues for a long time, right? We already had a full plate. We had a full plate suing Boston police for racial profiling, suing schools for disparities in the way that they treat black kids, right? So that's the work that had kept us busy under the Obama administration, and that work hasn't gone away. That work continues. And then on top of that, we've had to file out of my little Boston office with just 7 lawyers, 2 lawsuits against Trump in the last year alone. One on behalf of sanctuary cities, just days after the executive order targeting sanctuary cities was issued, and the latest one just weeks ago on behalf of Haitian and Salvadorian TPS recipients. And so we have had to mobilize in ways that we've never had to do before. We've never sued a sitting president at the Lawyers Committee. We've had to do that. We've never represented cities because we're in the business of suing government entities. We're in the business of making sure that municipal and state players are respecting our rights and the Constitution. And we've had to, go outside of the box and really rethink the strategies that we're using. And we started representing cities that would be affected by the Trump administration's unconstitutional and discriminatory executive orders. So when we talk about the scale of the work, it is nothing short of crazy. The amount of work that we've had to do, not just in my office, but at MALDEF and at many of the other organizations represented here, to use the courts as a bulwark to protect our communities. And so there is a significant amount of endangering the lives of people who look like us and our brothers and sisters in minority communities. And like you said, Tom, it's a deliberate and intentional effort from the White House. And that's why it's critically important for all of us to stand in collaboration and coordination to push back hard.
Thank you. Claudia, how has this targeting of the Latino community affected the work that you've done for so many years?
Sure. So I think on the heels of some of what Ivan just mentioned, the increased level of attacks that are coming from the executive branch. Every single day, it feels that there is a new attack on immigrant community. And when we talk about the immigrant community, we have to recognize that this is an issue that impacts in a very disproportionate way Latino Americans. When we look at the issue of DACA recipients, and me being one of them, DACA recipients are predominantly Latino. They are living in states with large Latino populations. It's no coincidence that some of the top states where DACA beneficiaries actually reside include states like California, Texas, Illinois, Florida. So when you start looking at how, I would say this is not even a malicious attempt, it's just very in-your-face attempt that every single day there is a new attack on the community. I think it's prompted us to work more effectively, to organize, right? I think that's been a critical element of our work. But at the same time, it's been also a reminder that in fighting for protections for the Latino community, we have to start shaping a vision that gives some sort of permanent solutions. That's something that has been challenging in the case of Dreamers. We haven't been able to see the passage of a DREAM Act that would provide a permanent pathway to citizenship for young immigrants to arrive to this country as children. But in a very similar context, we saw, we see with TPS holders, these are long-term residents of the United States, people that have now been stripped from their protections, and people that for many years deserve the opportunity to adjust status and be able to be well integrated into American society. So I think the bulk of the work, in our case, at the Center for American Progress, our focus has been on research, turning that research into advocacy and making sure that our partners and people on the ground are equipped with the tools that they need to fight back. But on the personal level, I think it's been this climate of just widespread fear and anxiety that it limits you in terms of planning your future, in terms of my contributions every day to my community, to my work. I'm wondering what is going to happen tomorrow. What if Trump makes a new announcement? Thanks to lawyers who have organized, there's been some successful legal victories that now allowed some beneficiaries, right, to renew into the program, but the program's still being closed for the thousands of immigrants who could potentially be part of the DACA program. So on our front, echo the sentiment that the work has been very fast-paced. It's been very dangerous, and I think at the heart of it is a very clear attempt to do a massive expulsion of people that have lived in this country for years, people that are entering this country. And it seems that through the power of the executive and through the Department of Justice, this administration is rewriting our immigration system in a way that Congress hasn't done, and they're doing it at a very alarming pace.
So, Hector, from your vantage point, both in the labor movement, where Latinos are an increasingly important component, regardless of what Trump may be able to do in terms of immigration enforcement, Latinos are a growing and important segment of the workforce. So from your vantage point at labor, how has this focus from Donald Trump on the Latino community affected the labor movement?
We have seen attacks on the Latino and immigrant community for a number of years. But I think under Trump, the racist mask of entire sectors of our nation came down, and it has literally opened waves of racism that are unapologetic in the nation. We have seen an increase on hate crimes against Latino and immigrants in the nation. We have seen an increase of like just everyday attacks. We've seen on TV every day, like if you're speaking Spanish on the parking lot, they say USA, speak English, or the chantings in a high school where a majority of Latino high school team was playing, and they start build the wall. Just mentioned a couple of examples of something that represents a pattern of attacks against the Latino community. But when it comes to the Latino workers, all these attacks affect the quality of life of Latinos on everything that we do over here. We can be talking about healthcare access. We can be talking about voting rights. We can be talking about immigration. We can be talking about any of the issues that we advocate for, and it affects the quality of life of our families. In the case of labor issues, because of Trump and all these anti-immigrant elements, we believe that the vulnerability of Latino workers in the nation has increased, regardless if you are an immigrant or not. Because especially now, all of us go through all these attacks, and we face all of these attacks. So our children, our families are facing all of these attacks. So in the workplace today, the Latino workers are the most vulnerable workers in the nation. We have the highest levels of death and injuries at work, the highest levels of wage theft, and something that is devastating, something that should not happen in a nation that claims to be the richest and most advanced nations in the world. What happens to our sisters trabajadoras in the nation? A drastic increase on sexual harassment and rape in the workplace, directly connected to a lot of the attacks, and all this anti-immigrant language is totally unacceptable. This is directly connected to the beautiful movement that we have seen this year with Rise Up, where you saw a lot of the spaces where our sisters are overrepresented, farm workers, or sisters cleaning hotels, in the service industry, in all the different industries that we have powerful sisters contributing so much to the nation, really saying enough is enough. But I think it's a direct correlation with what is happening over there, and it's affecting the quality of jobs that we have in our families, in our community, the quality of protections, everything related to the economy. And going back to the issue of Dr. King, remember that Dr. King at the time, 50 years ago, it was directly correlated to the economy, the Poor People's Campaign. If we analyze a lot of the communities that are under attack today, we are overrepresented when it comes to be working class families. And today what we have seen in the nation, especially with the historical concentration of wealth, how do we explain that 3 people have the same wealth that almost 50% of the population in the nation? I think all these issues are directly correlated to how do we explain that we have somebody like Trump? Some days I really wake up and I try to explain myself, how do we get in this democratic process to somebody like Trump? And I think we need to attach everything to the economy, the issue of immigration to the economy. It's an economic issue. We are a hypocritical nation that is addicted to cheap, exploitable, and disposable labor. And the nation has manipulated this conversation and blame it on people that are contributing to the sector, so many sectors of the economy, instead of thanking them for maintaining those sectors. So it's so critically important, but I think we need to be stronger in the economic analysis and the economic empowerment analysis.
I agree. And we'll get to the economic analysis in a bit. But Dr. Rios, it often seems like discussions about medicine and healthcare for many, many years have been treated as though those issues are colorblind, that they're not racialized, perhaps in the way that other issues are. But hidden behind that facade is a lot of racial disparities and the like. So talk a bit, if you would, about how those disparities may be being exacerbated by this administration, its rhetoric as well as its policy proposals.
Sure, I think health disparities in this country are, it's just really sad that we have a 2-standard lifestyle in this country. those who have and those who have not. And for those who have not, the workers, the middle class, the working class, Latinos, we have to struggle even more just to have food on the table in a shelter, and to get kids to go to school and stay in school and not think about suicide. Our suicide rates are over the top for Latino adolescents, because that's when you start thinking about your identity and you know, are you a gang member or you're not a gang member? And just because you look like a gang member to somebody else. And especially for immigrant families, mixed families, you've got generations living together in one household who just don't get all the things that are happening at different levels, for the geriatric level, the adult level, the adolescents, and we've got so many crises within our families. I think that's the disparities that we have to figure out how to be able to survive with what we have in a way that's productive for the families to continue, whether it's wealth and a little bit of money, having jobs, having education. But I think that that's the crisis that we are in terms of health. And then it's a mental health. It's very much a mental health issue, and why we need more mental health. And then I think the other thing, just to round out the conversation here, this administration has attacked healthcare very comprehensively, from access issues. So we have an insurance system now, the Affordable Care Act, and we have an enrollment system that was cut in half. The Spanish language part of the website was eliminated. People were not paid to help do outreach. All the Latino organizations that had been embraced by the previous administration to help with education and outreach were stopped from meeting. And so we had to do what we could on our own, and with all the organizations helping to get the word out that insurance was still the law of the land, the Affordable Care Act, and that we should enroll so that we could have affordable insurance and have better access to health care. And then this administration decided not to give subsidies to the insurance companies to allow to have cheaper insurance rates for the working poor. And that is another slap in the face for access. And then, of course, the prevention fund and having prevention programs in our country through CDC was totally cut. And we didn't even know we were going to have children's health insurance or community health centers up until a few months ago. And those were finally reauthorized. And we're actually involved in a lawsuit for the first time, the National Hispanic Medical Association, against EPA. The environmental health in this country, the whole concept of global warming, that is a major health crisis that we all know is real. And EPA decided that the only scientists that would be allowed to be on their advisory committees, and we are, after all, a professional organization speaking up for the importance of leaders from our communities to be on these types of committees, that the only ones that would be eligible would be from the industries that they're actually regulating. And that, to me, that's really hypocritical. And so environmental health and asthma and respiratory diseases and all of these, the emissions for cars, I mean, geez, so we're going backwards to the 1950s. And I know that the regulations in this country for healthcare are going to be cut as much as possible, just to be able to decrease government, which is really the kind of the backbone of a Republican-focused effort, is always to cut back on government instead of health being public health and wanting to have government to be able to increase the quality of life for everyone through programs like, everything from transportation to housing to having clinics in our communities, and more, of course, more Latino doctors and nurses. So there's just so much that's going backwards.
Yeah. Let's focus for a moment on the economy and workforce. So, Claudia, you talked a bit about the steps that the administration has taken to threaten the work authorization of over 800,000 DACA recipients. And at the same time, Yvonne mentioned that the administration has also threatened the continued presence and work authorization of hundreds of thousands of folks with temporary protected status. So when you put those two together, that's 1 million folks, over 1 million folks in our national workforce who the administration is threatening to remove, which makes not a lot of sense to me when we are at a level of unemployment that most would suggest is full employment. So Claudia, talk if you would about what it would mean to take so many young immigrant workers, and in some cases with TPSers, obviously they've been in the workforce here for over a decade and longer. But what would it mean to take all those folks out of the workforce, and how can we reinforce how important it is that the country as a whole see this as an issue of the economy as much as it is about immigration?
Absolutely. So as you mentioned, there are nearly 800,000 individuals who are currently working, who are enrolled in the DACA program, or as we knew it. The disruption that is caused by ending the program and the economic analysis that CAP and some other organizations have done show us that, from state to federal level GDP, there are going to be billions of losses annually from removing individuals from this workforce, but also looking more deeply into family dynamics where DACA recipients, TPS holders, and many living in mixed status families, sometimes those individuals are the sole providers of their families. So when you start looking at, in a lot of the recent immigration policies that have been put forth by this administration have been guided mostly by really radical ideologies that have been rooted on very xenophobic views. In fact, many of the individuals who worked at organizations, some of which the Southern Poverty Law Center has deemed to be hateful organizations, these are individuals that are now in an advising capacity at the agency level in the administration. These are the voices that are leading these decisions. So you are not seeing a huge actual economic analysis behind these decisions. You're simply looking at the power of the pen. And when you start looking at DACA recipients in particular, one of the things that DACA did is that through work permits, individuals are now able to access jobs that will match their talents. And that in itself means that an individual is able to access a higher paying job. That means that, due to payroll taxes and just the local contributions of these individuals, that is all money that is going to the economy. DACA recipients purchase homes, they purchase cars, right? There are all these elements of the economy in which they're integrated now that they're part of the formal workforce. And in rural communities in particular, this is going to take a heavy hit. This is a part of the United States that we often talk about. Some of the workers and areas, particularly in the Midwest, where we haven't seen a level of economic growth, and particularly around wages. But DACA recipients are actually, 4 in 10 have actually purchased a car. Many are purchasing homes. So what is going to happen to these individuals when they can't make their car payments, where they can't make their loan payments? And so that is when you start looking at how much states will be losing. And there is a comprehensive list, and I could go through a whole list of billions of dollars that, depending on states, but states like California would lose significantly, right? States where you have a large number of DACA beneficiaries. So it is a loss for the economy, and this is why you've seen a lot of business leaders that have come against some of these policies. There is a whole level of organizing that is happening now with business leaders advocating for TPS holders, advocating for DACA beneficiaries, and at the same time looking at a more intersectional lens. DACA also paved the way for women to access better positions, for women to be able to access positions that by virtue of gender they were underpaid or they were not able to work. I think in industries where they could access more legal protection. So that is important to recognize, right? And then there's also DACA recipients who are parents. So it's having like a deep impact. When you look at the immigrant population broadly, for instance, there are 6 million children, U.S. citizen children in the United States who live with at least one unauthorized parent. That could include a DACA recipient. That could include a TPS holder, right? So when you start looking at the numbers, you're talking about sending this country, and particularly the children of immigrants, at risk of falling into poverty, which research shows that that's often not the case. Usually the children of immigrants are less likely to fall into poverty, more likely to access opportunities that previous generations of immigrants didn't have. So there is progress, there is economic growth. And what the administration is doing is putting these policies that are sending us back and that are limiting opportunities. And immigrants have revitalized a lot of the more rural areas of the United States, and they've started businesses at higher rates than the native born. So it's been, I think, a challenge to even make those assertions about like how much the American taxpayer loses with these policies because of the hateful agenda that often clouds the reality, right, in these communities. And at the Center for American Progress, we had recently a police officer, actually a chief from Storm Lake, Iowa. If you look at Storm Lake, Iowa, this is a place where immigrants have come to revitalize that community. They've opened churches, they're open businesses. In fact, now they're looking at housing policy because they have a concentration of immigrants that are growing and that they are lifting that community. And now they need to build more homes because people are purchasing homes. So the economic contributions are there. The realities will obviously vary per region, but when you start looking at what it looks like on the day-to-day, America loses with these policies.
Mm-hmm. And that's the headline. This administration elevates nativism over the economy, over the workforce, but it doesn't get reported that way. Mm-hmm. So Yvonne, you indicated that you're in litigation around TPS. Why don't you just explain briefly what TPS is, the threat, and what that translates into in communities?
Temporary protected status, TPS, is humanitarian immigration protection that's offered to nationals of countries that are experiencing either environmental disasters or armed conflicts. So we're talking about a human rights humanitarian program that has been in place for a long time. Countries have been participating off and on for decades. This program has existed under both Democrats and Republicans, right? This isn't a blue or red issue. This is a human rights and human dignity issue. This is your country cannot take you back because of the conditions, because of the earthquake, because of the hurricane, because of the armed conflict that is happening in those countries. And we have a long tradition of having that welcome mat for people here. And it's a discrete program, like you mentioned, Tom, and as Claudia was talking about. This is 200,000 people, essentially. But they have been here for a long time, right? Some people, for example, our clients in our TPS litigation have been here for almost 2 decades. Mm-hmm. They have deep roots in their communities. They're fixtures of their communities. One of our clients not only owns his home, but he owns 4 businesses that employ over 20 Americans. These are people who are economic engines in our communities. And out of the blue, the administration decided that it was going to just start systematically dismantling this type of humanitarian protection country after country. We saw it happening in the beginning of the summer with Sudan, then in the fall, Haiti, and most recently, El Salvador. And many people expect that Honduras will be next. And so this is a huge problem at the ground level. One of the problems that, building on the really great comments from Claudia, is that many of these families have U.S. citizen children, kids that have gone through our schools. we are losing our investment in their education by sending these kids who either have high school degrees or college degrees abroad. And more importantly, many of these TPS recipients are in key industries. In Boston, where we brought our TPS case, many of the Haitian American TPS recipients are nurses in a growing industry at a time when baby boomers are retiring. Mm-hmm. In a state like Massachusetts, we need more nurses, not less. And deporting these people by canceling their temporary protected status is not just contrary to federal law and to protections against this type of discrimination from people who come from perceived shithole countries, but also deeply damaging to the economy in the way that we've been talking about. So this lawsuit is about protecting communities, it's about protecting families from being deported to countries that simply don't have the infrastructure to receive them, and after they've made many contributions to our society.
So shifting gears a little bit, Hector, you have spent a tremendous amount of time focusing on the federal workforce. Mm-hmm. We've seen at the top of this administration a decided decrease in the representation of the Latino community. We have one cabinet member. Mm-hmm. And certainly in the lower positions, we're not seeing prominent Latinos or Latinas at all. Instead, we're seeing folks, as Claudia mentioned, who are coming from arenas, from organizations that previously would have been considered inappropriate for federal employment. But talk a bit about the ongoing problem of Latino underrepresentation in the federal workforce and whether there's any chance for progress under this administration.
Yeah, no, that's a critical, I think, question that is directly correlated to the quality of life of our Latino families. I think as an advocate, a lot of times we are really responded to the serious needs that our community has. Immigration, lack of access to health, serious quality of education, which Latinos sometimes get the worst education. So structural problems that affect our communities. With the work as chair of NHLA, with our Grace Vice Chair Tom Sainz in NHLA, we really are looking at the issue of power, Latino power in the nation, and how it correlates to the challenges that we face on all these issues. I honestly believe that the fact that we are probably the most underrepresented community when it comes to the important spaces of power has a direct correlation with the quality of life of our families. We are the most underrepresented group when it comes to Latinos in the federal government. Serious problems of underrepresentation when Latino presidential appointments. We launched a campaign under President Obama. We were asking for 3. And through an entire process and campaign, at the end, we got 4 Latinos in the cabinet. Serious underrepresentation of Latinos in public office. Now, if we look to other infrastructures of power, like the Supreme Court, how do we explain that in the history of this nation, we only had 1 Latina in the Supreme Court? If we look at Wall Street, if we look at corporate world, etc., it's a situation that is so important when we look at Latino power in the nation that we launch a campaign that is called Latino Power 2050. To structurally connect the work that we do on the ground and put a constant pressure on these infrastructures to the issue of underrepresentation of Latinos in all those spaces. Mm-hmm. When it comes to the federal government, I mean, remember the important role that the federal government has to provide direct services, to provide, just look at all the different agencies. And not having Latinos in those agencies is a serious problem. It creates challenges in our communities, and not only in general in the federal government. It's from the entry level to mid-level, but the space where we have the most serious underrepresentation is at ACSs, at the senior level in the federal government. Right now, some of the people, a lot of the heroes in the nation that are holding the line against all the extremism and the craziness that is coming from this president are actually in those agencies that implement a lot of the national policies on the different issues. Doctora, you mentioned the Environmental Protection Agency. Now we call it the Environmental Pollution Agency because it goes against all the values. But I know so many great people in that agency that are literally trying to oppose and hold the line against all these like lobbies of the oil industry, literally running that agency. We can talk about HHS. HHS is the space that has the most serious on the representations of Latinos. Only 3% of the workers in HHS are Latinos, at a time when Latinos are facing some of the most serious challenges when it comes to health, etc. And we can go through all the different agencies. The important part is, as advocates and as a nation and as we continue with all the work of this administration, it's important to also look at the serious issues on the representation in all these spaces and create a structural pressure to make sure that Latinos have those opportunities. Doing this work with my brother Tom Sainz in all these spaces, we hear so many times that they only hire the best and the brightest. Mm-hmm. We only hire the best and the brightest. We heard this directly from a secretary to the different agencies to the different spaces. The interesting thing is that we had access to research that shows the high level of nepotism that many of these spaces have, and they're not hiring the best of the brightest. They're hiring their primos, they're hiring their friends in the communities, they're hiring other spaces. And obviously, we don't want to look at nepotism at this White House because they don't think they're hiring the best and the brightest. So it's important for us to make sure that if we're 20% of the population, that all these agencies reflect the diversity of the beautiful diversity of this nation.
Dr. Rios, you've worked throughout your career on the healthcare workforce and the lack of diversity there, both Yvonne talking about nurses in Boston and Hector talking about HHS. We know that these are ongoing problems. Some of it seems to stem from stereotypes that our community isn't interested in this field, isn't interested in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. Very early in my tenure, someone very connected in the business community said that part of the reason that businesses supported dreamers but weren't as invested as they might be was their perception that dreamers were not STEM majors. And shortly after that, I met with a group of community college administrators, and they had the complete opposite view. They're the ones who actually deal with these kids, and they said that's absolutely wrong. The vast majority of dreamers are STEM majors. So talk a bit about what we can do, what we need to do to get better representation in the healthcare workforce for the Latino community.
Yeah, I think we need to have more counseling and mentoring of the parents in our families, and let them know that it's so important to have students be disciplined and go to school and be competent and understand that they can do math and science. And then we have to talk to the students through the counselors and the teachers in this country about the importance of encouraging students to flourish in whatever academic pursuit that they feel comfortable, but to make sure that they do understand math and science. And I think that the issue of math and science curriculum and counseling and mentoring in this country has been part of the Department of Education's focus for a long time, but only as a requirement. And our goal, this is from the National Hispanic Medical Association, is if the only way we're going to increase the pipeline to healthcare careers, nurses, doctors, dentists, health scientists, is by getting to the grammar school, middle school, high school kids in this country and to expose them to the opportunities. The healthcare industry in this country cannot be outsourced. You have to be in a hospital, you got to be in a nursing home, you got to be in a medical office, a dental office. It's the #1 industry in the country, and it's growing. And especially with the baby boomers, there will be a lot more need for technology and home health care and all the aspects of an industry with jobs that are at all levels, not just professional, but at all levels. And what we're looking at, and we've been looking at now for a few years, and I think it's finally going to happen, is the Higher Education Act, where the Higher Education Act in this country has set aside funding for Hispanic serving institutions, as well as historically black schools and tribal colleges. And they have special set aside funding to help those students understand how they should go to college. High school students should go to college, and college students should graduate. But what they haven't had is a career approach or a focus on jobs and the fact that you could be fulfilled in a career in healthcare and health careers. And that's what we're trying to do with, actually with Congressman Raul Ruiz and others, with the Energy and Commerce Committee and the Education and Workforce Committee, and also on the Senate side. There's been a lot of interest in the idea that we look at health careers and mirror that with STEM education and math and science and build it out as a pathway. Because so many of our Hispanic serving institutions and our Hispanic students that do go from high school to college, and we do have a success track record of students who do end up going to college, but they go to community colleges. And those are the Hispanic serving institutions or state schools. And they don't see that they could go transfer to a four-year university and apply to medical school. But the fact is they could if they had the awareness of what it takes from one year to the next to be able to take the biology, the chemistry, the math, and then to get the financial aid and the information to be able to apply to these professional schools. And it's not just medicine, it's dentistry, it's nursing, it's public health, it's pharmacy. And we're working very hard with the Office of Minority Health, actually, on conferences for college students in the Mid-Atlantic, Texas, and California over the next 5 years. And actually, we're conducting a research project with a virtual mentoring program to be able to find the Latino students that are in medical school, nursing school, dental school, and be mentors for these college kids. And anyway, it's a positive story in a sense, but I know that what you were getting at, Tom, is our workforce has been we are only 5% of the doctors in this country. We are only 2% of the nurses in this country. And it's just a shame that this country has not invested in public education and in education that is career advancement and mentoring and everything that it takes to have an academic fulfillment of children, especially when their parents are not educated and don't understand college. We're all first generation in our families, and we understand the importance of giving back and building the cadre of workforce. And that's really what our organization is about, in trying to develop more leaders within healthcare, because we want to go back to our communities and get more students to think about health careers.
Terrifically important issue. Let me shift gears again. We've talked a lot about the threats, but certainly 15 months ago when the Electoral College placed Donald Trump in the White House, we also saw a resurgence of involvement in marches, in civic engagement of all kinds, people running for office, inspired by what occurred in the Electoral College. And we are now in 2018, facing the first federal election since Donald Trump won the Electoral College. I think we're already seeing some of the unfortunate implications of our being in a midterm election year. As an aside, we all know that several months ago, Donald Trump characterized himself as a stable genius. Now, I interpreted that as referring to the stable as a place, and that he was comparing himself to horses and cows and chickens, and if you do that, then you might well be a genius. Though I would put my bet on Mr. Ed against Donald Trump. But of course, he was referring to stability. But what we are seeing, particularly in the last week, is increasing instability. For example, targeting by tweet, very nasty tweet, Dreamers on Easter. On Easter Day, a day that certainly in My religious tradition was about charity, not about targeting. And we've seen increasingly desperate measures announced, including today this notion of the National Guard at the border, that seem to be designed to appeal to a very small base, extreme right voters, as Donald Trump faces the prospect of a very real, very significant rejection of his policies in November. Even this week, Senate Majority Leader McConnell said that they're facing a headwind in this election, and they know it. So you all have seen this other element, folks becoming more involved, folks wanting to do something. What do you expect, each of you, in this midterm election, and what can folks do to take that energy inspired by what the Electoral College did 15 months ago and channel it into productive outcomes? I'm going to let you decide who goes first. Who wants to go first?
I'm happy to.
Claudia.
I think one of the biggest challenges is going to be translating that energy and that movement into electoral power, given the challenges of states targeting communities of color to restrict their access to voting, but at the same time, making sure that there is investment in the community so that there is the outreach that is needed, that there is the support for organizations that are building on the ground, that are creating a pipeline of leaders, and that are encouraging people to go out and vote. So what I think is happening, and I can't predict the future, clearly we can, but one of the things is heading into, and I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought here, but one of the things looking into the next few months is that we are going to see an increase in these attacks. Donald Trump might tweet more. Not only that, his extremist base will continue to go after immigrants. There are already proposals that are moving forward very drastically that would radically, like I mentioned, reshape our immigration system. But the targeting is going to continue. So I think what's important from now until the prospects of an election that will shift the base of power is to show that there is that power from the Latino community. What concerns me is that when you look at the map of where there are these races, they're also in states that are predominantly red. So it sometimes worries me that at the national level, when we talk about progressive voices, there isn't sometimes that inclusion for communities. So issues like immigration become a third, fourth tier issue because they don't want candidates to address that. So I think we have to also shape the narrative in such a way that the issues that impact the Latino community, whether those are related to tax accountability work, whether it's related to some of the issues that are happening around healthcare, but on immigration, making sure that being pro-immigrant is not perceived as something that causes individuals to lose elections. And I think that is where a very small minority has made it seem as if talking about immigration policy is a bad thing. And the tweets of Donald Trump exemplify that. The fact that he doesn't understand the issue, that he's spreading myths such as these ideas and notions that people coming to the border, which are border based on recent statistics by the Department of Homeland Security themselves, shows that it is a net zero, that there hasn't been border crossings. But the reality is that we have to make sure that there is inclusion of Latinos at every level. And I think we have to make sure that organizations are listening to these voices. Because when you look at red states, you have Latinos also living in red states. When you look at places, when you look at Pennsylvania, I did some work in Pennsylvania and did some door knocking. And I met a whole community of Dominican Americans. And it was fascinating to me to go to these communities and learn that there are Latinos living, and that we need to make sure that those Latinos are not living in the shadows, that they're going out there. And that even for dreamers and for communities that don't necessarily have the ability to vote right now, that there is a responsibility to organize. Dreamers speak English. They can organize their communities. I have people that call me and want to know why I think about certain candidates. So I think it's important for us to mobilize and organize so that collectively we show that power, but also demand more from organizations in Washington to invest on the organizations that are doing work to advance the Latino community.
So, Hector, I know you have a perspective on this very issue of investment.
Yeah, I mean, democracy is extremely expensive. Let's talk for a second about the imperfections, the serious imperfections of our democracy, especially under the presidency of Donald Trump. Why do we have an electoral college that works like that? Why all the issues of gerrymandering? MALDEF is one of our leading advocates on fighting voter suppression. In a perfect democracy or in a good democracy, you try to make it easy for everybody to participate in the democratic process. It's the opposite taking place all over the nation. It's making it harder for Latinos and other minorities to participate in the democratic process. We can talk about gerrymandering. We can talk about the census, and especially the census and what is going to happen now that they want to include the citizenship questions. But the point, and this takes me to your question, Tom, that is so critical, and very few people in the nation are analyzing this from this perspective. How expensive democracy is, and the serious underinvestment of money in the Latino community when it comes to everything related to civic participation and democracy. My organization does a lot of the civic participation issues, voter registration, GOTV, voter education. All this has a price. I can tell you exactly how much it costs to do a voter registration in the Latino community. The problem is that the most important spaces in the nation, it doesn't matter if they're conservative or progressive, are not investing in the Latino community. They just generalize and say Latinos don't vote. Well, when we do a more serious analysis and we see where they're investing their monies, we can see that they're not investing in the Latino community. We can go after foundations and really see, which is something we're doing lately, really focus on who's investing. Foundations spend only 1% to 2% of their money in Latino-related issues. And when it comes to civic participation, we don't see almost any money. Organizations like the ones we have under the NHLA are doing miracles with armies of volunteers to get people out to vote. When we look at the parties are also not investing in the Latino civic engagement efforts. They take our community for granted. So for us, it's very important to transform and turn this conversation to really put a structural pressure on these spaces, but at the same time make sure that our community is coming out. I'm so hopeful of what is going to happen and what is happening right now, because at a time when we're facing so many challenges, the Latino community is leading by example and embracing the beauty of democracy. We're marching, we're coming out to vote, we're running for office. Everything that represents civic participation, the Latino and immigrant community is in the front lines showing what democracy is all about.
Dr. Rios, how do we take the energy that was there after the Electoral College put Donald Trump in office and make sure that it's going to achieve the change that we're looking for?
Well, I can only talk about our networks that we've been developing, and I have to say that we just had our national conference a week ago, and I did something different this time, and we invited local community organizations that are Latino health oriented from major cities where we have a presence. We developed an organization at a top-down approach from Washington, D.C. In fact, we started at the White House in the Clinton White House, and we went to regions, and we have a cross-section of networks, a council of young physicians, a council of residents, a Latino medical student group, and we needed to talk to others, not just doctors talking to doctors, and we decided that we really needed to bring in those Latino consumers, patient advocates who are working on heart disease or diabetes or HIV or what have you, who don't have a network because they're isolated and they're trying to do what they can with the money they have. And so I see that that's something that we have as a network. Leaders at a community level that are very engaged in the health of their own communities through whatever program they work on, because they know that fundamentally we have to be healthy in order to be stronger. And in order to get healthcare services, you have to have funding from the government. It's all about clinics and public health. So there is a connection with the leadership of our organizational network. And we also work with the Hispanic nurses and the Hispanic dentists and all the Hispanic health professional associations. But to go down to a more grassroots level, I think it's what's going to take. And I think professional organizations who are alumni of major universities, we all are all connected to other groups. We need to figure out how to maximize our potential as a force of like you said, of energy and excitement about taking back our country and having more ability to improve our communities, which is why we're doing what we're doing. So I think.
So Yvonne, I'm going to give you the last word. In this midterm election year, what do we need to do to take the promise of that increased interest and activism at the grassroots level and make the most of it?
I think we've already seen it. We're seeing it across the country when Latina women are coming out and saying, "Yo también," as Me Too sweeps the country. We see it as the march that was scheduled in the Boston Common immediately after Charlottesville had no more than 100 white supremacists and over 20,000 people. We see it every day that people in majority minority communities are exercising leadership and power. And I think it is deeply inspiring to see these manifestations of courage, to see the DACA recipients, to see the TPS holders standing up and saying, this is where we draw the line in the sand and we're not going to take any more discrimination and oppression. I think our communities are quickly realizing that power is our birthright and that we are going to use every means possible to get into the ballot box, to vote our conscience, and to make sure that we are at the table as decisions are being made about people who look like us. And so I'm very much inspired about the election, and I think that we're going to do it because, as we've learned historically, sí se puede.
What a terrific panel. I want to thank all of them for participating in this Latino State of the Union event. Your insights have been informative, valuable, and I think in the end, optimistic. I'll talk a bit about that in a second, but let me thank again Hector Sanchez, Claudia Flores, Iván Espinosa Madrigal, and Dr. Elena Rios.
Thank you.
So we began our panel discussion with a recognition of the similarities between 2018 and 1968, 50 years ago, when on this date, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was taken away from us tragically by an assassination. A recognition that the same fears in the civil rights community occasioned by that assassination and events that followed was being echoed in this year of 2018. But we ended with a recognition that this is a different country than it was in 1968. Certainly at MALDEF, where we are celebrating our 50th anniversary this year, we know that the Latino community and the nation as a whole have changed from 50 years ago. And what we heard at the end from our panelists was a note of tempered optimism, a recognition that we cannot be overconfident, that we cannot expect the problem to solve itself, but an understanding that when we work together, not just in the Latino community, but with other communities as well, we can be the change and make the change that we envision for this country. My personal journey with MALDEF began 25 years ago, in 1993, halfway through the 50 years that the organization has had at this point. I started out in our Los Angeles office in an era of unprecedented anti-immigrant sentiment in the legislature and believably in the electorate. Indeed, in 1994, California passed Proposition 187, to date, probably the most anti-immigrant measure ever enacted in this country. The state sought to restrict immigrants' eligibility, indeed with significant influences, negative influences on citizens as well, but sought to restrict immigrants' eligibility to every public service imaginable, from law enforcement to public social services, health care, to kindergarten through 12th grade education and higher education. The then governor of California, Pete Wilson, used Proposition 187, which he helped to qualify for the ballot, to drive his re-election campaign. And indeed, the proposition passed by 58% of the vote. On a more hopeful note, and a note important to remember, Proposition 187 passed by 58% of the total vote, but 75%, according to exit polling of Latino voters, voted against it. And majorities of Asian American and African American voters in California, after a hard-fought campaign, voted against Proposition 187 as well. It always amazes me when politicians today fail to attend to the lessons of history. It's quite clear that Donald Trump is no student of history at all. But perhaps if he was attentive to what happened in California, he would understand why he is already engaging in increasingly dangerous and unstable rhetoric tied to the midterm election. Pete Wilson did gain his re-election in California, but his political career ended rather abruptly after that. I think he had a presidential campaign that lasted about a minute. And since then, he's not been heard of in California. Indeed, when he came out of hiding to endorse Meg Whitman, it helped to contribute to her significant defeat for governor of the state of California more recently. California changed, and most pundits would say significantly, because of what happened with Proposition 187. It would be too facile to say what we face on a nationwide level is completely analogous to California in the 187 era. But there are lessons to be learned. I think most importantly, with what we're facing on a national level, with the second president in a generation who's in the White House despite losing the popular vote, the lesson is that we have to work together with other communities to make real the potential of those who believe in a more inclusive America, who believe that we must be the immigrant nation we always have been, including a recognition of the ongoing contributions of the millions who have been here without full legal protection, but contributed to our economy, to the development of our society, and certainly to raising the next generation of leaders in this nation. We must begin by ensuring that representation is provided to the Latino community in every sector of society. In 2015, when a very unlikely presidential candidate announced his campaign with a slur against Mexican immigrants, he calculated that he could get to the White House by targeting our community. What made it possible for him to make that calculation and then prove it true with the Electoral College's vote of 15 months ago was the lack of understanding and awareness of the Latino community throughout large swaths of our nation. Part of that relates to our ongoing underrepresentation in the areas that we've already described, but in other areas as well. Latinos are the most underrepresented of all racial ethnic groups in the country in our depiction in movies and on television. Unmatched, we are the most underrepresented. We are the most underrepresented in comparison to our population in the C-suites of corporations across this country. We are the most underrepresented in comparison to our population in leadership of sector after sector. We have a special responsibility then in the Latino community to take the energy out of November 2016 and lead. Lead as the largest minority group in the country for over a decade. Lead in cooperation with the other groups that have been targeted repeatedly by this president. And lead with our allies in other communities who may not be targeted today, but may face similar targeting in the future. The Latino community, given this president's history from the beginning of his campaign forward, given the underrepresentation that we have tolerated for too long, have a special responsibility to ensure that the change we need to see in this country comes to pass. in this 50th anniversary of the assassination of Dr. King, we have an opportunity in the Latino community to take his beliefs in organizing, his beliefs in equality, his beliefs in a deep equality that went beyond formal, but translated into real results. We have an obligation and a responsibility to step forward in this era and demonstrate our community's leadership in seeking and obtaining the progress that we need. I'm confident, based on what I saw in California shortly after I started as a young staff attorney at MALDEF in 1993. I'm confident as I see every day in the work that we do, the courage of Latinos and Latinas who step forward at great personal cost to be plaintiffs in lawsuits, to obtain significant change, and then to take the results of cases and make them real. Last week, I had the pleasure of being in Bakersfield, California, to announce a settlement of an important lawsuit that MALDEF brought to ensure representation of the Latino community on the Kern County Board of Supervisors. For the first time, Kern, a rural county, would have 2 potential candidates, members of the Board of Supervisors, elected by the Latino community. The air of energy and optimism that this change provided work in organizing, in putting forward positive candidates and getting them elected in November could be transformative for Kern was truly inspiring. That's what we need across the country and in every sector, not just the Kern County Board of Supervisors, but in media and entertainment, in corporate sector, in the academic sector, in healthcare, and certainly in policy making, where we have an obligation to make sure, given our community's ongoing personal family understanding of what it means to be a nation built by immigrants, to respect their ongoing contributions. Our obligation is now. In this 50th anniversary celebration of MALDEF, I know that we will be there working to ensure with all of you that the Latino community and its allies take that responsibility seriously and ensure that we make the change, lead the change that our nation needs. Thank you all very much for joining us in this very important day, an anniversary of significant importance even today, 50 years later, and for this critically important discussion of all of the challenges faced, but that will be faced successfully by our Latino community. Thank you.